Hello, my name is Nicole Johnson. This is my presentation on Chapter 9 in our book, Radical Behaviorism for ABA Practitioners, the chapter is titled Social Life. The book is by James Johnston. This chapter primarily deals with culture, and it starts off with trying to explain what is culture. Culture is the combination of non-social contingencies and social contingencies. The combination of these two constitutes our cultural behavior. Non-social contingencies are culture-free contingencies. That means they're absent from the contributions of others. The book gives an example of throwing something. We don't need to be shown how to do it. We don't need the help of anyone to do it. We might have learned how to do it from somebody else, but we don't need their help. So it's our interaction with the physical environment, and it is limited by our bodies as we engage with the world and the way it works around us. And the book gives the limitations of our musculoskeletal system as well as our senses on page 164. Social contingencies, on the other hand, are influenced by others. They are the learned behaviors shared by a group's members, acquired from their membership within that group, and transmitted from one member to another. Most noticeable is our verbal repertoire, allowing us to participate in all manners of our cultural practices. That is, we learn to behave as members of a group. We learn customs, manners, and values within that group, and our roles change over the years. We are not passive recipients, but we give and take as members of the social environment. So the combination of that influence as well as the culture-free contingency, combine those, we have what we call our cultural behavior. Before proceeding in the reading, the author cautions us to be careful within the same chapter that we are to make sure what we have to understand that our views come entirely from others, and there's no such thing as making a choice within your culture or thinking within your culture like we've read in prior chapters. We have to be careful not to explain our contributions of our social history as our own. We're all socially influenced by our environments. The second point is that cultural practices are not the behavior of groups, but the collective result of the behavior of multiple individuals, each influenced by their unique histories. In the book, later on, when they discuss how the transmission of cultural practices happens or occurs, it'll be explained by reference to the operant learning process, which you all know is the fundamental concept of behavioral science. The third point is that cultural contingencies have their effects not on the culture as a whole, but separately for each member of the culture. The effects are individualized. Under the paragraph natural selection, there's a whole discussion on the evolution of cultural practices. Box 9.1 on page 167 talks about the phylogeny and ontogeny effects and how those work within the evolution of these cultural practices. And just a reminder that it is the physical environment and the biological processes that help us to do so. Under natural selection, like I said, it discusses how the human behavior is a joint product of the special contingencies maintained by an evolved social environment, but it occurs at a much slower pace. That says space, it should say pace, which makes it harder for behavioral scientists to study, but because it involves human behavior, individual human behavior, they're able to study that. The elements of natural selection, Skinner had made a reference or made an analogy reference between operant conditioning and natural selection. So if you know anything about natural selection, these are the same terms that are used there, and Skinner uses them to explain the evolution of cultural practices. They are variation, transmission or replication, and selection. So first, there must be a variation in cultural practices for selection to be meaningful. On page 166, he gives the example of the hat, that individuals' behavior wearing a hat is prompted by family members, friends, weather conditions, and other variables, and that individual will wear that hat depending on the different variables. So each time we engage in a particular behavior, some of its features vary from previous instances and may go unnoticed. If you remember your reading on response classes, this is an example on it. Selection is determined by the different functions a behavior activity serves. In the book, it uses the same example of the hat, that some people wear a hat to church, some people might not wear it to the grocery store. Transmission only occurs when members find a certain practice beneficial, and it will occur across generations. Cultural practices are learned through the environment, schools, family members, others around you, and it involves imitation. So we imitate behaviors that result in reinforcement for other behaviors. Imitation is modeled by others, and we imitate those behaviors that are successful. And this is explained by our tendency to follow rules, as we read in prior chapters. Some key points that are made within this chapter is that there are particular variations of a cultural practice that must be selected if they are to continue and be strengthened. This is normally through social reinforcement, and it's because we want to comply as ordered by the members of the group. So there's always some degree of social reinforcement. Certain practices generate more social reinforcement than others. Baum, I believe that's how I'm saying it, attempted to explain that through reinforces, using proximate and ultimate reinforces. Proximate reinforces take the form of socially mediated consequences, and when we behave in culturally approved ways, others may provide reinforces. However, the proximate reinforces can only work as they depend on ultimate reinforces, which have to do with health and reproductive fitness in the long term. Sorry, I'm trying to read my notes and look at the screen at the same time. But that is on page 168. What was interesting to me is that the author devoted almost 7 to 8 pages on the role of behavioral science on the topic of culture. And the question is, can cultural change be engineered by behavioral scientists? And it starts on page 169, and it's titled, Where Can This Lead? And the author poses various questions such as, can a science of behavior determine the implications of certain cultural practices? Can science learn about the origins of those cultural practices and why they continue to be supported? Can behavioral science researchers identify both short-term and long-term consequences of cultural practices? And it goes on to pose other types of questions. And despite posing those questions, they do say that there is a challenge. And the challenge is that people will disagree with the advice from various practices. Therefore, the term engineering cultural change, the action becomes quite difficult to do. And he gives the example of the 18th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which was prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. It became ineffective and was repealed in 1933. He says we have to remember that a cultural practice must be shared by its members, acquired from their membership, and transmitted from one member to another. And these characters are likely to emerge only when members find a certain practice beneficial. And obviously they didn't, and hence why we if you read about the prohibition, you will see that that was a consequence of that. Smoking is the other example that was used. In the United States, they said smoking was prevalent. It was found in pretty much in every community. People smoked cigarettes, cigars, pipes in almost all social settings. Ashtrays were available in doctors' waiting rooms. Even Santa Claus was depicted in ads giving cartons of cigarettes as gifts. But today, smoking is culturally disapproved, and it took half a century. There are organized laws that are put in place by governments intended to discourage certain practices that are in place. such as taxation of certain goods. If you go to the workplace, some organizations have new employee practices, and some companies change their culture to include religious communities doing so. And again, the challenge is that any changes to the deemed rights and values of its members presents conflict. The other interesting portion of this reading was devoted to obesity in the United States. And the author again poses several questions as to what to do with this. Can behavioral science help with obesity and the influence of media on obesity? And he talks about counter control, introduces the term counter control. And counter control is the back and forth between the controller and the controllee. And it's on page 173, titled Who is in Control? Then he talks about, and he uses counter control to explain why some laws might fail while others pass. Okay, my next slide is cultural engineering. It says we have to be careful not to make the mistake in implying that one practice or another is a characteristic of an entire country, region, province, or state. So saying that is a culture of a country or region or province or state is a huge mistake. That geographical or geopolitical boundaries have little to do with the definition of culture. Culture is what we defined earlier. Each of us is a member of multiple cultural groups, work, our friends, our interests, and so forth, and we adjust our behavior accordingly. That is culture. And it gives the example of the ABA practitioner in a new environment and having to adjust to the culture that is present within that workforce. It gives suggestions on how to engineer changes. It starts off with you giving the suggestion that perhaps we should analyze the contingencies already associated with the practice under consideration or that might be required. It says to determine if the relevant contingencies are contrived or natural and to require support from other members of the culture and provide reinforcement. So that is found on page 176. And that is titled not titled How to Engineer Changes. I did that, but it's under the paragraph titled Cultural Engineering. Survival value of cultural practices. I apologize for that. B.F. Skinner observed that culture is an ongoing experiment behavior. Cultural practices are selected by their consequences in the same way that individual repertoires evolved. Some practices will stay, some cultural practices will stay, and they will grow stronger. Others will wither and disappear, some because they are proved useful, and some are not useful. Cultural practices are evaluated in terms of their survival value. That means the extent in which they contribute to the survival of the culture. I made that bold because there's a question that follows up, a discussion question that follows up on that term, survival value. So survival value is the extent in which they contribute to the survival of the culture. So what works for the culture today might not work for the culture in decades or generations to come. And I think we can all think of several examples from past histories to today that are just not there anymore. And again, I apologize for the mistake for the title. It should say survival value of cultural practices. So the final question is, or the only question is, I'm asking for each one of us to choose a specific cultural practice and consider how you might evaluate its survival value for the culture. And I give, again, I refer to the box 9.4 on page 177 for an explanation of its meaning. The title of the box is Survival Value of Cultural Practices, and not what I have up here, which is Survival Culture of Cultural Practices. That doesn't make sense. So it should be survival value of cultural practices. I look forward to your responses. Thank you for bearing with me through this presentation.